I still remember the sound of bulldozers that morning, the mechanical growl that shattered my peace and destroyed 3 years of work in just 15 minutes. But what happened next? Well, that's a story of standing up against corruption that I never thought I'd have to tell. Hey everyone, before I dive into this wild story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA that went too far, drop a comment below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Growing up, my grandmother always told me that a garden was more than just plants in the ground. It was a piece of your soul that you nurture every day. I guess that's why losing mine felt like losing a part of myself, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Rachel Thompson, and until 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was the American dream in Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't the biggest house in Riverside Heights, but it was mine, and more importantly, it had the perfect south-facing backyard for what I'd always wanted. A garden that would make my grandmother proud. When I first bought the house 3 years ago, that backyard was nothing but patchy grass and weeds, but I had a vision. Every weekend I was out there from sunrise to sunset. My neighbors probably thought I was crazy, especially Mike Anderson, next door, who'd watch me hauling wheelbarrows of compost and laying out garden beds in the middle of winter. "You know you can hire someone to do that, right?" He'd joke over the fence. But this wasn't just about having a garden. It was about creating something with my own hands, something that would last. By the second year, my hard work was paying off. The raised beds were bursting with vegetables. Heirloom tomatoes, rainbow chard, purple carrots you couldn't find in any store. The butterfly garden I'd planted along the fence had become a sanctuary for monarchs and bumblebees. I'd even started hosting monthly garden-to-table dinners for the neighborhood kids, teaching them about where food comes from. The garden became more than just my hobby. It was my contribution to the community. Local schools would bring students for field trips to learn about sustainable gardening. The elderly couple down the street, the Parkers, would stop by for fresh vegetables when their arthritis made it hard to get to the store. Even our local food bank got weekly donations during harvest season. Lisa Crawford, who runs the local gardening club, once told me my garden was becoming the heart of Willow Creek Estates. "It's not just the plants," she said, "it's what you're doing for the community." Those words meant everything to me. I thought I had finally found my place, my purpose. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. The first sign that something was wrong came during the Willow Creek Community Association's annual meeting. I usually skipped these. I had better things to do than listen to debates about mailbox colors and lawn height regulations. But this time, Mike insisted I come. "They're talking about park expansion," he warned me. "You might want to hear this." I wish I'd paid more attention to the worry in his voice. The meeting started like any other. Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, was at the podium, perfectly coiffed hair and practiced smile in place as she talked about property values and community aesthetics. I was half listening, mentally planning my spring planting schedule, when something she said caught my attention. "And now, for our most exciting announcement." Karen's voice had that particular tone of enthusiasm that always made me uneasy. "The board has been working on a proposal to expand Sunnyside Park. We've identified several adjacent properties that could be repurposed for the greater good of our community." My stomach dropped. My property backed right up to Sunnyside Park. But surely they couldn't just take someone's private property for park expansion, right? After the meeting, I tried to catch Karen to ask about the plans, but she was mysteriously unavailable. Sarah Wilson, the board secretary, assured me that everything would be handled according to proper procedures, whatever that meant. I should have known then that something wasn't right. But I had faith in the system, faith that property rights meant something, faith that 3 years of building a garden that benefited the entire community would count for something. That evening, as I walked through my garden, checking on my early spring seedlings and listening to the wind chimes my grandmother had given me, everything felt suddenly fragile. The butterfly garden was just starting to wake up from winter. Tiny green shoots pushing through the soil. The herb spiral was filling the air with the scent of fresh mint and thyme. The grape arbor I'd built last summer was finally strong enough to support this year's vines. I took pictures of everything that night. I didn't know why, just a feeling that I needed to document what I'd built. Looking back now, I think some part of me knew what was coming, but I had no idea just how bad it would get. No idea that, in just a few months, I'd be facing not just the loss of my garden, but a fight that would expose corruption at the heart of our community and test everything I believed about justice and standing up for what's right. If you want to know what happened next, how a simple garden became the centerpiece of one of the biggest HOA scandals in our state's history, make sure you're subscribed to catch the next part of this story. Trust me, what happened next will make your blood boil. It was early March, and the morning frost still clung to my garden beds when I first noticed something was different. I was doing my usual morning inspection of the seedlings when I spotted unusual markings on the ground near my back fence. At first, I thought they might be from local kids cutting through the yard. It wouldn't have been the first time, but these were different. They were surveyor's marks, bright orange lines and cryptic numbers spray-painted onto my lawn, creating mysterious patterns that led from the park boundary right through my vegetable garden. My first instinct was to call Mike Anderson, my neighbor who'd warned me about the park expansion plans. Mike had lived in Willow Creek Estates for over a decade and seemed to know everything that happened in our community. But when I tried to reach him, his wife said he was out of town on business. That should have been my second warning sign. Mike never missed his morning coffee on his back deck, where he could keep an eye on the neighborhood. Instead of waiting for Mike to return, I decided to walk over to the HOA office. It was housed in a small building near Sunnyside Park, where Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, held court every Tuesday and Thursday morning. The office always reminded me of a small-town mayor's headquarters, trying too hard to look important. With its fancy wooden desk and walls covered in community awards and framed newsletters. When I arrived, Karen was already there, perfectly put together as always in her cream-colored blazer, typing away at her computer with manicured fingers. She looked up when I entered, and her smile was just a little too practiced, a little too perfect. "Rachel, what a lovely surprise. How's your little garden project coming along?" The way she said "little garden project" made my skin crawl. 3 years of work, countless community events and educational programs, reduced to a hobby in her eyes. But I kept my voice steady as I asked about the survey marks in my yard. Karen's response was a masterclass in evasion. "Oh, those, yes. We're just doing some preliminary assessments for potential community improvements. Nothing to worry about right now. Actually, since you're here, I'd love to get your input on some ideas we have for enhancing the neighborhood's green spaces." She pulled out a glossy brochure from her desk drawer, the kind of expensive marketing material that made you wonder about HOA dues allocation. The cover showed an artist's rendering of an expanded Sunnyside Park, complete with a fountain, walking trails, and what looked suspiciously like a private events pavilion. But something caught my eye that made my heart skip a beat. The expanded park boundaries in the drawing extended well into what was currently my property. "This is just a preliminary concept," Karen said, watching my reaction carefully. "We're exploring various options for community enhancement. You know how important property values are to everyone here in Willow Creek Estates. And while your garden is charming, we need to think about what's best for the entire community." Pointed to the area that was clearly my property.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This is my land, Karen. My house, my garden. You can't just decide to turn it into a park. Her smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. Rachel, dear, sometimes we need to think bigger than our individual preferences. The board has been discussing ways to modernize our community amenities for months. These plans could really put Willow Creek Estates on the map. As she spoke, Sarah Wilson, the board secretary, entered the office. She carried a stack of papers and gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Karen immediately brightened. Sarah, perfect timing. Could you bring me the community enhancement proposal? I think Rachel would benefit from seeing the full scope of our vision. Sarah hesitated for just a moment before retrieving a thick binder from a filing cabinet. As she set it on Karen's desk, I noticed the title, Willow Creek Estates Renovation and Property Acquisition Strategy. Property acquisition. The words hit me like a physical blow. Karen flipped through the binder, pointing out various sections with perfectly manicured nails. You see, Rachel, Willow Creek Estates is at a crucial juncture. We have an opportunity to transform our community into a premier residential destination. The expanded park is just phase one of a comprehensive plan to elevate our neighborhood's profile. As she spoke, I noticed something else in the binder. A map of the entire neighborhood with certain properties highlighted in yellow. My property was among them, along with several others that bordered the park. In the margin, someone had written Phase 1 Acquisition Targets. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, trying to keep my voice level. My property isn't available for acquisition. I'm not interested in selling or participating in any expansion plans. Karen's smile took on a slight edge. Oh, Rachel, I think you might want to keep an open mind about this. Change is inevitable, and it's always better to be part of the process than to stand in its way. Why don't you take some time to think about it? We're prepared to offer very generous compensation packages to homeowners who choose to cooperate with the community's vision. The way she emphasized choose to cooperate sent a chill down my spine. I left the HOA office that morning with a growing sense of unease. On my way out, I overheard Sarah making a phone call, mentioning something about accelerating the timeline and securing the necessary approvals. Back home, I immediately started documenting everything. I took photos of the survey marks, wrote down my conversation with Karen, and made copies of the park expansion drawings I'd seen. Something told me I'd need this evidence later. That evening, as I worked in my garden, I noticed more activity than usual around the park. People in business attire walking the perimeter, pointing and making notes. They weren't wearing any official city or county identification, but they moved with the confidence of people who thought they had authority. I was pulling weeds near my butterfly garden when Lisa Crawford, the gardening club president, stopped by. Her usually cheerful face was creased with worry. Rachel, have you heard what they're saying about the park expansion? They're talking about revitalization and modernization, but something doesn't feel right. Lisa had been in Willow Creek Estates even longer than Mike. She'd seen other HOA boards come and go, but this was different. Karen's been meeting with private developers, she whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. Big meetings, after hours, and they're not just talking about the park, they're planning something much bigger. As we talked, a sleek black SUV pulled up near the park. A man in an expensive suit got out, followed by Karen and two other people I didn't recognize. They stood at the edge of the park, gesturing toward my property and the other homes that bordered it. The man in the suit nodded approvingly, making sweeping gestures with his arms, as if already imagining whatever they planned to build. Lisa squeezed my arm. Be careful, Rachel. Karen's got friends in high places, and she's not used to people saying no to her. Whatever you do, document everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. The gentle sound of wind chimes that usually soothed me now seemed to be sounding a warning. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, researching property rights, HOA regulations, and local zoning laws. The more I read, the more concerned I became. While HOAs had significant power over certain aspects of property maintenance and appearance, they couldn't simply seize private property for expansion projects. At least, they weren't supposed to be able to. The next morning, I noticed something else. A small group of people walking through my garden, taking pictures and measurements. "This is my land, Karen. My house, my garden. You can't just decide to turn it into a park." Her smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. "Rachel, dear, sometimes we need to think bigger than our individual preferences. The board has been discussing ways to modernize our community amenities for months. These plans could really put Willow Creek Estates on the map." As she spoke, Sarah Wilson, the board secretary, entered the office. She carried a stack of papers and gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Karen immediately brightened. "Sarah, perfect timing. Could you bring me the community enhancement proposal? I think Rachel would benefit from seeing the full scope of our vision." Sarah hesitated for just a moment before retrieving a thick binder from a filing cabinet. As she set it on Karen's desk, I noticed the title, Willow Creek Estates Renovation and Property Acquisition Strategy. Property acquisition. The words hit me like a physical blow. Karen flipped through the binder, pointing out various sections with perfectly manicured nails. "You see, Rachel, Willow Creek Estates is at a crucial juncture. We have an opportunity to transform our community into a premier residential destination. The expanded park is just phase one of a comprehensive plan to elevate our neighborhood's profile." As she spoke, I noticed something else in the binder. A map of the entire neighborhood with certain properties highlighted in yellow. My property was among them, along with several others that bordered the park. In the margins, someone had written Phase 1 Acquisition Targets. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "My property isn't available for acquisition. I'm not interested in selling or participating in any expansion plans." Karen's smile took on a slight edge. "Oh, Rachel, I think you might want to keep an open mind about this. Change is inevitable, and it's always better to be part of the process than to stand in its way. Why don't you take some time to think about it? We're prepared to offer very generous compensation packages to homeowners who choose to cooperate with the community's vision." The way she emphasized "choose to cooperate" sent a chill down my spine. I left the HOA office that morning with a growing sense of unease. On my way out, I overheard Sarah making a phone call, mentioning something about accelerating the timeline and securing the necessary approvals. Back home, I immediately started documenting everything. I took photos of the survey marks, wrote down my conversation with Karen, and made copies of the park expansion drawings I'd seen. Something told me I'd need this evidence later. That evening, as I worked in my garden, I noticed more activity than usual around the park. People in business attire walking the perimeter, pointing and making notes. They weren't wearing any official city or county identification, but they moved with the confidence of people who thought they had authority. I was pulling weeds near my butterfly garden when Lisa Crawford, the gardening club president, stopped by. Her usually cheerful face was creased with worry. "Rachel, have you heard what they're saying about the park expansion? They're talking about revitalization and modernization, but something doesn't feel right." Lisa had been in Willow Creek Estates even longer than Mike. She'd seen other HOA boards come and go, but this was different. "Karen's been meeting with private developers," she whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Big meetings, after hours, and they're not just talking about the park, they're planning something much bigger." As we talked, A sleek black SUV pulled up near the park. A man in an expensive suit got out, followed by Karen and two other people I didn't recognize. They stood at the edge of the park, gesturing toward my property and the other homes that bordered it. The man in the suit nodded approvingly, making sweeping gestures with his arms, as if already imagining whatever they planned to build. Lisa squeezed my arm. "Be careful, Rachel. Karen's got friends in high places, and she's not used to people saying no to her. Whatever you do, document everything." That night, I couldn't sleep. The gentle sound of wind chimes that usually soothed me now seemed to be sounding a warning. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, researching property rights, HOA regulations, and local zoning laws. The more I read, the more concerned I became. While HOAs had significant power over certain aspects of property maintenance and appearance, they couldn't simply seize private property for expansion projects. At least, they weren't supposed to be able to. The next morning, I noticed something else. A small group of people walking through my garden, taking pictures and measurements. When I confronted them, they claimed to be from a community planning consultancy and had permission to be there. Permission from whom? They wouldn't say. I called the local police non-emergency number to report the trespassing, but by the time an officer arrived, the group was gone. The officer, a sympathetic woman named Rodriguez, took my statement but said there wasn't much they could do without evidence of damage or explicit threats. She did, however, advise me to start keeping a detailed log of all such incidents. Later that day, I received an official-looking letter from the Willow Creek Community Association. Inside was a notice about upcoming community improvements and a reminder about the HOA's right to access properties for assessment purposes. The language was vague but threatening, filled with references to bylaws and regulations that could be used against uncooperative homeowners. I tried calling Mike again, hoping he'd returned from his business trip. This time he answered, but something was off about his voice. "Rachel, I can't really talk about this right now," he said quietly. "Just be careful. They're not just talking about the park anymore. There's big money involved." Before he could say more, he ended the call. The Mike I knew would never back down from a fight for what was right. What had Karen and her board done to make him so cautious? That evening, as I worked in my garden, I noticed more people taking pictures, not of the flowers or vegetables, but of the property boundaries, the structures, the access points. They tried to be subtle about it, pretending to be admiring the plants or just passing by, but their intentions were clear. I started taking my own pictures and videos, documenting every interaction, every suspicious visit. I set up security cameras around the property, making sure they covered all angles. If Karen and her friends were planning something, I wanted to have evidence. The next week brought more subtle pressures. The HOA suddenly found violations in my garden setup. Structures that had been approved years ago were now supposedly non-compliant. I received citations for excessive vegetation and unapproved landscaping modifications, despite having followed all proper procedures when installing my gardens. Each morning seemed to bring a new challenge. One day, I found my water pressure mysteriously reduced, making it difficult to maintain the garden. The next, there were complaints about offensive odors from my composting system, the same system that had won an environmental award from the city just months earlier. But it was the conversation I overheard at the local coffee shop that really opened my eyes to what we were dealing with. Karen was there with the man in the expensive suit I'd seen earlier, speaking in low voices about property acquisition strategies and community renewal initiatives. I couldn't hear everything, but what I did hear made it clear. This wasn't just about expanding a park. This was about money, power, and the systematic transformation of our community into something that would push out long-time residents in favor of luxury developments. As I ended my day in the garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized this was just the beginning. The subtle pressures, the mysterious visitors, the vague threats wrapped in official language. They were all just the opening moves in what would become a much bigger battle. I looked at my grandmother's wind chimes, still singing their gentle song in the evening breeze, and made a decision. If Karen Mitchell thought I would quietly give up the garden I'd poured my heart into, she was about to learn otherwise. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up to corruption and fighting for the soul of our community. What happened next would test not just my resolve, but the very foundations of our neighborhood. But that's a story for part 3. If you want to know how this conflict escalated from subtle pressure to outright warfare, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to stand up to corrupt officials in your community. I read every comment, and your stories give me strength. The morning after my confrontation with Karen at the HOA office, I woke up to find 3 separate violation notices taped to my front door. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. The first claimed my vegetable plants exceeded the maximum allowed height for decorative vegetation. The second cited unauthorized agricultural activity in a residential zone. The third warned about excessive wildlife attraction. Apparently my butterfly garden was drawing too many actual butterflies. These weren't just random harassment. Each violation came with a specific fine, and each fine was carefully calculated to fall just under the threshold that would allow me to contest it in small claims court. Karen Mitchell might have been corrupt, but she wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what she was doing. That same morning, Jennifer Hayes from the local news showed up at my door. She'd heard rumors about the park expansion project and wanted to do a story. As we walked through my garden, Jennifer took notes about the community programs I'd developed, the school visits, the food bank donations, the gardening classes for seniors. But halfway through our interview, her phone rang. When she came back, her demeanor had completely changed. "I'm sorry, Rachel," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "My editor just killed the story. Apparently, it's not newsworthy enough." Later, I would learn that Brian Phillips, the construction company owner who'd been meeting with Karen, sat on the board of the news station's parent company. Another door closed, another connection revealed. The pressure continued to mount in subtle ways. The water pressure issues became more frequent. My mail started arriving late, or sometimes not at all. The garbage collectors somehow kept missing my house. Small things, each one easily explained away as a simple oversight, but together forming a pattern of orchestrated harassment. Mike Anderson, my neighbor who'd first warned me about the park expansion, finally told me the full story one evening over our shared fence. He spoke in whispers, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "They got to me through my business," he admitted. "I own a small construction company, and suddenly all my permits started getting delayed. Karen's husband works in the city planning office. They made it clear that my cooperation in the community would reflect positively on my permit applications." The next day, Tom Sullivan from the city council paid me an unexpected visit. He was apologetic but firm. "Look, Rachel, I admire what you've done with the garden, but you need to understand this park expansion is going to happen. The votes are already lined up. Karen and her people have been working on this for months. They've got investors, politicians, everyone who matters on board. You might want to consider their offer while it's still on the table." I asked him directly if this was legal, using HOA authority to force people out of their homes. Tom just gave me a sad smile. Legal is a funny word when you have enough lawyers involved. Just think about your future here. Some battles aren't worth fighting. But this battle was worth fighting. That evening, as I walked through my garden, documenting each plant, each structure, each improvement I'd made over the years, I found myself getting angry. Really angry. Not just at Karen and her corrupt schemes, but at the whole system that allowed this to happen. I started researching similar cases online. It turned out this wasn't an isolated incident. HOAs across the country had been used as tools for property developers to force out homeowners, usually under the guise of community improvement projects. The pattern was always the same. Target specific properties, create impossible conditions for the owners, then swoop in with lowball offers when people got desperate. Emma Parker, one of the seniors who regularly attended my gardening classes, brought me a stack of old community newsletters. "I've been keeping these," she said, "thought they might help." Looking through them, a pattern emerged. Over the past year, Karen had been systematically replacing long-standing board members with people connected to various development companies. The groundwork for this takeover had been laid long before anyone noticed. The HOA started holding special meetings about the park expansion, always scheduled at times when most working residents couldn't attend. When I did manage to attend one, I found the room packed with unfamiliar faces, people who didn't even live in our community, but were somehow allowed to vote on community matters. Lisa Crawford from the gardening club tried to speak up at one of these meetings. She questioned the legitimacy of allowing non-residents to vote on neighborhood issues. The next day, she received notice that the gardening club's charter was under review for violation of community standards. The message was clear: oppose us and we'll destroy everything you've built. Then came the property assessments. The HOA hired an independent evaluator to assess all the properties marked for acquisition. Unsurprisingly, the evaluations came in well below market value. My house and garden, which local realtors had recently valued at well over $400,000, was suddenly worth only $250,000, according to their assessment. Karen used these artificially low valuations to argue that our properties were bringing down neighborhood values and therefore needed to be rehabilitated for the good of the community. It was a perfect circular argument. Our properties were worth less because they said they were worth less, which justified taking them at those lower values. The surveillance became more obvious. Cars would park outside my house for hours, taking pictures. Drones would fly over my garden despite the clear violations of privacy laws. When I complained to the police, they said they couldn't do anything without proof of who was operating the drones. Sarah Wilson, the HOA secretary, approached me one afternoon as I was working in the garden. She seemed nervous, glancing around, constantly as she spoke. "Rachel, I need to tell you something. This isn't just about the park. They're planning to sell the entire expanded area to a private developer, luxury condos, high-end retail, the works. But it goes deeper than that. There are kickbacks, fake contracts, money changing hands. I've seen the paperwork. Before she could tell me more, Karen appeared at the end of my driveway. Sarah quickly made an excuse about checking my fence height and hurried away. But her words confirmed what I'd suspected all along. This was about more than just community improvement. The next week, I received an official-looking document from the Willow Creek Community Development Authority, an entity I'd never heard of before. It outlined their right to acquire and repurpose properties for community development, citing obscure bylaws and regulations. The document was clearly designed to intimidate, full of legal jargon and veiled threats. I took the document to James Rodriguez, a lawyer friend who specialized in property rights. He spent an hour reading it, making notes and shaking his head. "This is interesting," he said finally. "They're trying to use HOA bylaws to exercise eminent domain-like powers. It's completely illegal. but they're betting most people won't know that or won't have the resources to fight it. Mark Davidson, a community mediator, offered to help negotiate a settlement. But during our first meeting, it became clear he was already in Karen's pocket. Every compromise he suggested involved me giving up my property. The only question was how much I would get in return. The pressure tactics escalated. One morning, I found all my garden tools had been confiscated. For safety inspection, when I demanded their return, I was told they needed to be certified for residential use, a requirement that didn't exist in any HOA regulation. Karen started hosting community information sessions about the park expansion. These weren't really information sessions at all, but propaganda meetings where she presented her plans as a fait accompli. The architectural renderings showed a completely transformed neighborhood, with my property and several others replaced by manicured lawns and artificial water features. During one of these sessions, I noticed Brian Phillips, the construction company owner, sitting in the back with a satisfied smile. He was already acting like he owned the place, which I would later learn wasn't far from the truth. His company had already been awarded the contracts for the expansion project, contracts that were signed months before any public announcement was made. The HOA board meetings became increasingly hostile. Anyone who questioned the expansion plans was shouted down or ruled out of order. Karen had stacked the meetings with supporters, many of whom I discovered were actually employees of various companies involved in the development project. Then came the letters. Every few days, I'd receive another official notice, each more threatening than the last. They cited various violations, threatened legal action, and always ended with the same offer: sell now or face the consequences. The price they offered kept dropping, while the threats became less veiled. My security cameras caught HOA representatives entering my property without permission, always when I was away. They would take pictures, measure things, and leave more. Violation notices. When I complained about the trespassing, Karen simply cited the HOA's right to inspect properties for compliance, a right that was meant for emergencies, not harassment. The final straw came when they started targeting my garden programs. The HOA suddenly decided that my educational activities constituted running a business from home and were therefore prohibited. They threatened to fine me $500 per day for every school group or gardening class I hosted. This hit me harder than anything else. The garden wasn't just my passion. It had become a vital part of our community. The local elementary school had incorporated my garden into their science curriculum. The senior center depended on the fresh vegetables for their meals program. The food bank received hundreds of pounds of fresh produce each season. I spent that night sitting in my garden, watching the fireflies dance among my plants, thinking about everything that was at stake. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up to corruption, about protecting not just my rights, but the rights of everyone in our community. The next morning, I made two important calls. The first was to James Rodriguez, asking him to take my case officially. The second was to Jennifer Hayes at the local news station. Even if she couldn't run the story, she might know someone who could. The morning after the bulldozer confrontation, I woke up to find my garden had become ground zero for a media circus. News vans lined the street, reporters clustered around my front yard, and my phone was exploding with messages. But amidst all the chaos, something felt off. The air was heavy with tension, like the calm before a storm. James Rodriguez, my lawyer, arrived early with a thick stack of papers under his arm. "They're already moving to discredit you," he said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "Karen's lawyers have filed emergency injunctions claiming you're in violation of multiple HOA regulations. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor." The legal documents were just the beginning. By mid-morning, the HOA had issued a press release claiming that I had violently confronted their workers and endangered a legitimate community improvement project. They even had the audacity to claim that my garden violated environmental regulations, the same garden that had won environmental awards. Sarah Wilson, the HOA secretary who had turned whistleblower, called in a panic. "They're shredding documents at the HOA office," she whispered. "Karen came in last night with a team of people. They're destroying everything they can't use against you." I immediately called Officer Rodriguez, but by the time the police arrived, the office had been cleaned out. The community started dividing into camps. While many neighbors stood with me, others bought into Karen's narrative. Emma Parker reported overhearing conversations at the senior center where people questioned why I couldn't just cooperate for the good of the community. The HOA's propaganda machine was working overtime. Mike Anderson discovered that his business licenses were suddenly under review. Tom Sullivan faced calls for his resignation from the city council. Even Jennifer Hayes was pulled off the story. By her network, the message was clear: support Rachel Thompson and you'll face consequences. But Karen had underestimated something crucial: the power of documentation. While her team was busy shredding papers, my security cameras had been running continuously. They captured everything: the late-night document disposal, the intimidation of witnesses, even Karen herself directing what looked suspiciously like evidence tampering. A surprise visit from Brian Phillips made things even more interesting. He showed up at my door looking nervous, nothing like the confident businessman who had tried to bulldoze my garden. "Look," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "this has gotten out of hand. Karen promised this would be simple: buy out a few properties, develop the land, everyone profits. But now she's talking about making examples of people. She's dangerous." I recorded every word of our conversation, as James had advised. Brian revealed that the development project was just a front for something much bigger. Karen had connections to multiple shell companies, each one designed to hide the true ownership of properties acquired through HOA pressure tactics. My garden wasn't the first target, just the first one to fight back effectively. The next HOA meeting became a battleground. Karen tried to bar me from attending, citing security concerns, but James Rodriguez was ready with a court order ensuring my right to be present. The meeting room was packed, with both supporters and opponents filling every available space. Karen stood at the podium, perfectly composed as always, but there was a new edge to her voice. "Recent events have made it clear that certain elements in our community are resistant to progress," she began. "While we respect the right to disagree, we cannot allow individual obstinance to hinder the greater good." That's when I made my move. With James's approval, I stood up and began presenting evidence, not just of the attempted property grab, but of years of systematic corruption. Security camera footage played on the meeting room's projector, showing Karen's late-night document. Disposal team. Financial records obtained through Sarah showed suspicious payments between HOA accounts and various shell companies. The room erupted into chaos. Karen tried to shut down the meeting, but the momentum had shifted. Board members who had previously supported her began asking uncomfortable questions. The carefully crafted facade was cracking. Then, Lisa Crawford dropped another bombshell. She had been quietly investigating Karen's previous community improvement projects in other neighborhoods. The pattern was always the same. Target properties were harassed with violations, owners were pressured to sell at below market rates, and mysterious shell companies swooped in to develop the land. Karen's response was telling. Instead of addressing the evidence, she attacked the messengers. She accused me of running an illegal business from my garden. She claimed Lisa was bitter about losing garden club funding. She even suggested that Sarah Wilson had mental health issues that affected her credibility, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. When Tom Sullivan presented documentation showing that Karen's husband had fast-tracked permits for Brian, Phillips' company, while rejecting competitors, even Karen's staunchest supporters began to waver. The meeting ended abruptly when Karen received a phone call that made her face go pale. Later, we learned that federal investigators had just raided Brian Phillips's office. The house of cards was beginning to collapse. That evening, as I walked through my garden checking for any damage from the previous day's confrontation, I found an envelope tucked into my butterfly bush. Inside was a USB drive and a note in Sarah's handwriting: insurance policy. Karen doesn't know I kept copies. The files on the drive were explosive. Emails, financial records, meeting minutes, everything the HOA had tried to destroy. But more importantly, they revealed connections between Karen's operation and similar schemes across the state. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about exposing a systematic abuse of HOA power. The next morning, Karen launched her counterattack. Private investigators began following me and my supporters. Strange cars parked outside our homes at all hours. My garden was vandalized, plants uprooted, structures damaged, all while police reports mysteriously failed to be filed. James Rodriguez advised me to install more security cameras and document everything. "They're trying to provoke you," he explained. "Don't give them anything they can use against you." His words proved prophetic when Karen's lawyers filed a lawsuit, claiming emotional distress and defamation. The community continued to polarize. Some neighbors who had initially supported me began to distance themselves, worried about becoming targets themselves. Others became more committed to the fight, forming a neighborhood watch to protect my garden and document any suspicious activity. Lisa Crawford organized a community meeting, not through the HOA, but as concerned citizens. The turnout was overwhelming. People shared similar stories of intimidation and harassment. A pattern emerged. Karen's group had been systematically targeting properties they wanted, using HOA regulations as weapons. The media coverage intensified. While local news was still largely controlled by Karen's connections, national outlets began picking up the story. My garden became a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach, attracting attention from property rights activists and community organizers across the country. Karen's facade finally cracked during a confrontation in my garden. She showed up unannounced, still perfectly composed, but with an edge of desperation in her voice. "You have no idea what you're up against," she hissed. "This is bigger than your little garden. We have people in every level of government, in every agency that matters. You can't win." I recorded every word, of course. Her threat became another piece of evidence in the growing case against her. But she was right about one thing: this was bigger than my garden. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been operating unchecked for years. The pressure continued to mount. My mail was mysteriously delayed or lost. My internet service became unreliable. Even my bank notified me of suspicious attempts to access my accounts. Karen's network was vast, and they were using every tool at their disposal to force me into submission. But they had underestimated the power of community. For every person they intimidated into silence, two more stepped forward to help. Local tech experts helped secure my communications. Retired law enforcement officers volunteered to provide security. Lawyers offered their services pro bono. The turning point came when Brian Phillips's company files were made public as part of the federal investigation. They revealed a complex web of shell companies, all leading back to a single holding company, where Karen Mitchell was listed as a silent partner. The development project wasn't just about expanding a park, it was about laundering money through real estate transactions. What happened next would shake our community to its core. But that's a story for part 6. If you want to know how we finally began to unravel Karen's network of corruption and the price we all paid for standing up to power, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever been part of a community that came together to fight corruption. Your stories inspire others to stand up for what's right. 2 days after the evidence of shell companies came to light, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. It wasn't from the HOA this time, it was from the State Environmental Protection Agency. According to the letter, someone had reported my garden for multiple serious violations, including contaminated soil and illegal water usage. The letter demanded immediate testing and threatened daily fines that would have bankrupted me within weeks. James Rodriguez, my lawyer, recognized the tactic immediately. "This is classic Karen," he said, examining the letter. "She couldn't beat you directly, so now she's using her government connections to attack from another angle." He was right. We later discovered that Karen's college roommate held a senior position at the Environmental Agency. The timing wasn't coincidental. That same week, every local garden center suddenly refused to sell to me. My regular suppliers for soil and compost claimed they were out of stock whenever I tried to place an order. Even the irrigation company that had maintained my watering system for years abruptly canceled our contract, citing liability concerns. Mike Anderson, who had been doing some digging through his construction industry contacts, discovered that Karen and Brian Phillips had been busy. They had reached out to every major supplier in the region, threatening to blacklist any business that worked with me. It was a coordinated effort to isolate me and make my garden impossible to maintain. But Karen had overplayed her hand. The Environmental Agency's sudden interest in my garden raised red flags with Jennifer Hayes, who had been quietly investigating despite being pulled off the story officially. She started looking into other cases where the agency had been used to target properties that developers wanted to acquire. Sarah Wilson continued to be our secret weapon. Still working in the HOA office, she had access to Karen's communications and kept us informed of every move. "They're planning something big," she warned one evening. "Karen's been having closed-door meetings with people I've never seen before. Something about accelerating the timeline." We didn't have to wait long to find out what that meant. The next morning, I woke up to find official-looking notices posted all over my garden. According to these notices, my entire property had been rezoned for public recreational use overnight. The rezoning meant I could no longer legally live in my own home. This was Karen's nuclear option. By using her connections to change the zoning, she thought she could force me out without having to prove any violations or win any legal battles. The rezoning would make my residential use of the property illegal, giving her the leverage she needed to force a sale. James Rodriguez immediately filed for an emergency injunction, but we knew we were in for a fight. Zoning changes typically required public hearings and community input, but somehow this one had been pushed through without any notification. Tom Sullivan, our ally on the city council, had been deliberately kept out of the loop. The community response was immediate and divided. Some neighbors, seeing the official rezoning notices, assumed this was a done deal and began distancing themselves from me. Others were outraged by the blatant abuse of power. Lisa Crawford organized a protest in front of the HOA office, while Emma Parker started a petition demanding an investigation into the rezoning process. But Karen had anticipated the resistance. The day after the rezoning notices appeared, private security guards showed up at the edges of my property. They claimed they were there to protect public space. But their real purpose was intimidation. They photographed everyone who came to support me, took notes on all activities, and created an atmosphere of constant surveillance. The security guards were just the beginning. Strange men in suits started appearing at my supporters' workplaces, asking questions about their connection to potential illegal activities. Anonymous complaints were filed against businesses owned by people who had spoken out against the HOA. The message was clear: Support Rachel Thompson and you'll regret it. James Rodriguez worked tirelessly to fight the rezoning, but we kept hitting bureaucratic walls. Every office we approached seemed to have been warned about us. Files went missing, appointments were cancelled, emails went unanswered. It was like fighting a ghost. We could feel the opposition, but we couldn't quite get a grip on it. Then came the psychological warfare. Karen started hosting community planning sessions right outside my property line. She would stand there with her architects and developers, pointing at my garden and discussing their plans for the space as if I didn't exist. They brought in landscapers to mark trees for removal and surveyors to take measurements, all just outside my property line. The pressure was getting to everyone. Mike Anderson's construction company lost several major contracts without explanation. Jennifer Hayes was passed over for a promotion she had been promised. Even James Rodriguez started finding unexpected obstacles in his other cases. Karen's network was vast, and she was using every connection to make our lives difficult. But we weren't without resources of our own. Sarah Wilson had been methodically documenting everything from her position inside the HOA office. She recorded conversations, copied emails, and photographed documents. Every piece of evidence was secretly passed to James, building a case that would eventually expose the entire corrupt system. The Environmental Agency inspection turned out to be another miscalculation on Karen's part. The inspectors who came to test my soil were actual professionals, not political appointees. They not only found no violations, but were impressed by my sustainable gardening practices. Their reports specifically praised my water conservation methods and soil management techniques. This victory gave us momentum. Jennifer Hayes, working through independent news outlets, began publishing a series of articles about suspicious zoning, changes across the city. Each case followed the same pattern: sudden rezoning, pressure to sell, and development projects that benefited the same small group of companies. Lisa Crawford organized a community garden tour, deliberately highlighting properties that had been targeted by the HOA. The tour revealed a pattern. Every targeted property was strategically located, either adjacent to existing developments or in areas planned for future expansion. My garden wasn't chosen at random. It was part of a larger land grab scheme. Karen's response to the growing exposure was to double down. The security presence around my property increased. Surveillance became more obvious and aggressive. Even my internet and phone services began experiencing mysterious interruptions. It was like living under siege, but the siege mentality brought unexpected allies. Neighbors who had initially stayed neutral began to see the bigger picture. They realized that if Karen could do this to me, she could do it to anyone. Small acts of resistance started spreading through the community. People would accidentally block the security guard's view of my property. Others would flood HOA meetings with endless questions, preventing any official business from being conducted. The turning point came when Brian Phillips's company faced a surprise audit. The auditors discovered irregularities that led them to the network of shell companies Karen had used to hide her real estate transactions. The complex web of financial relationships began to unravel, revealing connections to multiple corrupt officials and questionable development deals. As pressure mounted, cracks began to show in Karen's facade. During a particularly heated HOA meeting, she lost her composure for the first time. When questioned about the rezoning process, she snapped, "Some people need to learn their place in this community." The outburst was caught on video and quickly spread through social media. Sarah Wilson's position became increasingly dangerous as Karen grew more paranoid. She started noticing that her desk had been searched, her computer accessed. One evening, she found Karen and two unknown men going through her files after hours. She pretended not to notice, but the message was clear. They suspected a leak. The next phase of Karen's plan was both desperate and dangerous. Official-looking workmen began showing up at all hours, claiming they needed to conduct infrastructure inspections on my property. When I refused access, they would show up with police escorts, citing public safety concerns. Each visit was an attempt to find or create violations that could be used against me. James Rodriguez worked to document each incident, building a pattern of harassment. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the security guards Karen had hired turned out to have a conscience. He approached James with recordings of his briefings, meetings where Karen explicitly directed the guards to intimidate and harass my supporters. The guards' evidence was damning. It showed Karen orchestrating a campaign of systematic harassment, using both legal and illegal means to pressure me and my supporters. But more importantly, it captured her discussing the real reason for targeting my property, a planned luxury development that would generate millions in hidden profits for her and her partners. The revelation of Karen's true plans energized the community. The same neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by with food and offers of support. Local businesses that had been intimidated into silence began speaking out. The wall of fear Karen had built began to crumble. But Karen wasn't finished. As her public power began to wane, she turned to more dangerous tactics. What happened next would test not just our resolve, but our very safety. That's a story for Part 7. If you want to know how Karen's desperate actions led to her ultimate downfall, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever witnessed power corrupting someone. In authority, your stories help others recognize and resist abuse of power. It happened on a Wednesday evening in late April. The sun was setting, and I was finishing up my daily garden maintenance when Mike Anderson called. His voice was urgent, warning me that he'd overheard something disturbing at a local bar. Brian Phillips had been drinking heavily, bragging about how they were going to solve the garden problem once and for all that night. I immediately called James Rodriguez, who advised me to activate all security cameras and stay alert. He also contacted Officer Rodriguez to request extra patrols in the area. Something about Mike's call felt different. This wasn't just another intimidation tactic. Around midnight, my security system's motion sensors started triggering. The cameras showed several figures in dark clothing moving around the perimeter of my property. At first, I thought it might be Karen's usual security guards, but these people were different. They moved with purpose, carrying large containers. I watched on the security feed as they began methodically spraying something on my garden beds. The smell hit me before I could figure out what they were doing. Chemical herbicide, industrial strength. They were poisoning my entire garden. Without thinking, I ran outside, phone in hand, already dialing 911. "Stop!" I shouted, filming. "Everything. What are you doing?" The figures scattered, but not before I recognized one of them, Brian Phillips himself, stumbling in his haste to escape. The damage was already done. By morning, my garden was dying. Years of work, carefully nurtured plants, and a thriving ecosystem were withering before my eyes. The butterfly garden, the vegetable beds, even the old oak tree that had stood for decades. Everything had been doused with industrial-strength herbicide. The police arrived quickly, but the perpetrators were gone. Officer Rodriguez took samples of the chemicals and documented the damage, but we all knew who was responsible. This wasn't just vandalism, it was environmental assault, and it crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sarah Wilson called early that morning, her voice shaking. She had overheard Karen and Brian planning this attack days ago. They thought it was foolproof, she said. Destroy the garden, make it impossible to maintain, force you to sell. Karen called it aggressive landscaping. Sarah had tried to warn us by leaving anonymous tips, but she'd been too afraid to come forward directly. The community's reaction was immediate and fierce. Emma Parker organized an emergency meeting at her house, bringing together everyone who had been affected by Karen's schemes. Lisa Crawford arrived with documentation of similar attacks on other properties, gardens destroyed, trees mysteriously dying, all coinciding with development pressures. Jennifer Hayes broke the story on social media, bypassing her network's restrictions. The images of my dying garden, juxtaposed with photos of its previous vitality, went viral. Environmental activists picked up the story, and suddenly, our local HOA dispute was making national headlines. James Rodriguez moved quickly, filing for emergency injunctions and preservation orders. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the men involved in the attack, racked with guilt, came forward. He provided a detailed account of how Karen had orchestrated everything, using Brian Phillips as her enforcer. The confession revealed a pattern of environmental vandalism stretching back years. Karen's group had been systematically destroying properties that stood in the way of their development plans, making it look like natural causes or negligence. My garden wasn't the first they'd poisoned, just the first time they'd been caught. Tom Sullivan called an emergency city council meeting. The evidence was overwhelming: soil samples, security footage, witness testimony, and now a confession. But Karen's response was chilling. She showed up at the meeting with a team of lawyers, claiming she was being framed by anti-development activists. The meeting quickly descended into chaos. Karen's supporters tried to paint me as an eco-terrorist, claiming I had poisoned my own garden to frame the HOA. But they hadn't counted on Sarah Wilson's meticulous record-keeping. She presented emails, meeting notes, and recorded conversations that proved the attack had been planned well in advance. The environmental impact was devastating. Soil tests revealed levels of herbicide far exceeding legal limits. The poison had seeped into the groundwater, threatening neighboring properties. What had started as an attack on my garden had become an environmental crisis for the entire community. Lisa Crawford organized an emergency response team of local gardeners and environmental experts. They worked tirelessly to contain the damage, setting up barriers to prevent the chemicals from spreading further. But the heart of my garden, the space I had nurtured for years, was destroyed. Karen's mask finally slipped completely. In a heated confrontation outside the council meeting, she revealed her true nature. "You should have just taken the money and left," she snarled, not realizing she was being recorded. "Now look what you made us do. This is what happens to people who don't know their place." Those words would come back to haunt her. The recording spread quickly through the community, destroying any remaining support she had. Even her most loyal followers couldn't defend the deliberate destruction of private property and environmental vandalism. The following days were a blur of police interviews, environmental assessments, and media coverage. Scientists from the state university came to document the damage and assess the long-term environmental impact. Their report was damning. The chemicals used were banned substances, imported illegally for the specific purpose of destroying vegetation. Brian Phillips, facing mounting pressure and potential criminal charges, began to crack. He reached out through his lawyer, offering to tell everything he knew about Karen's operation in exchange for leniency. His testimony would reveal a conspiracy far larger than anyone had imagined. The human cost was becoming clear as well. Elderly residents who had relied on my garden's produce for fresh vegetables now had nowhere to turn. The children's educational programs had to be suspended. The butterfly population, which had been thriving in my garden, disappeared overnight. But the community refused to be defeated. Neighbors began offering their yards for temporary gardens. Local businesses donated supplies for soil remediation. Environmental groups provided expertise and resources for cleaning up the contamination. What Karen had meant to destroy was instead bringing people together. Mike Anderson's construction, Company offered to help with the cleanup, using their equipment to remove contaminated soil. Emma Parker organized a fundraiser to help cover the environmental restoration costs. Even people from neighboring communities came to volunteer. Having faced similar battles with corrupt HOAs, the legal consequences were swift and severe. The Environmental Protection Agency, embarrassed by how their authority had been misused, launched a full investigation. Local law enforcement, armed with concrete evidence of criminal activity, began building cases against everyone involved. In the attack, Karen's empire started to crumble. Board members, fearing legal exposure, began resigning. Development partners distanced themselves from the project. The web of shell companies and fake contracts began to unravel as investigators followed the money trail. But the story wasn't over. Karen had one last card to play, a desperate gambit that would expose the full extent of her corruption and lead to her ultimate downfall. That's a story for Part 8. Through all of this, my garden lay dying, a testament to how far some people will go to maintain their power. The herbs my grandmother had originally given me, the butterfly bushes that had attracted monarchs every summer, the vegetable beds that had fed countless families, all were casualties of Karen's vendetta. James Rodriguez advised me to document everything meticulously. "This isn't just about property damage anymore," he explained. "This is about systematic corruption, environmental crimes, and the abuse of power. What happened to your garden is evidence of a much larger criminal conspiracy." The environmental scientists who studied the damage discovered something even more disturbing. The particular combination of chemicals used suggested premeditation and expertise. Someone had specifically formulated this herbicide mixture to cause maximum irreversible damage while making it difficult to trace. Sarah Wilson continued gathering evidence from inside the HOA office, though her position was becoming increasingly dangerous. Karen, paranoid and desperate, had started monitoring employee communications and installing surveillance cameras in the office. But Sarah's careful documentation would prove crucial in the coming legal battles. If you want to know how we finally brought Karen Mitchell to justice and began the long process of healing our community, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever witnessed environmental destruction used as a weapon. Your stories help others understand the real cost of corruption. The morning after my garden was destroyed, David Chen, a forensic accountant recommended by James Rodriguez, arrived at my house. He carried a laptop and several external hard drives, ready to begin what would become the most thorough investigation our community had ever seen. David had experience investigating corporate fraud, but even he wasn't prepared for what we would uncover. Sarah Wilson had been quietly collecting documents for months, carefully copying emails, contracts, and financial records. Now, with my garden's destruction serving as a catalyst, she finally felt safe enough to bring everything forward. The amount of evidence was staggering. Over 5 years of systematic corruption, all meticulously documented. David set up a makeshift command center in my dining room. The walls soon became covered with flowcharts and timelines, mapping out the connections between Karen's various shell companies and development projects. What emerged was a pattern of corruption that stretched far beyond our community. Jennifer Hayes, working independently now after leaving her network job, began cross-referencing Sarah's documents with public records. She discovered that Karen's husband, working from his position in the city planning office, had been manipulating property values and zoning regulations for years. Properties would be devalued through targeted HOA violations, then purchased by shell companies at below-market rates. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Mike Anderson found a connection between Brian Phillips's construction company and a series of environmental disasters in other communities. Similar cases of Garden destruction and property damage had occurred wherever Karen's development group had interests. They had been using environmental vandalism as a strategic tool to force property sales. Tom Sullivan, using his position on the city council, began reviewing years of permit applications and zoning changes. He found dozens of cases where Karen's group had pushed through developments without proper environmental impact studies or community input. The paperwork had been rubber-stamped by corrupt officials who were later found to have received consulting fees from Brian Phillips's company. Lisa Crawford's gardening club members proved to be invaluable allies in the investigation. They had been keeping detailed records of plant diseases and environmental changes throughout the community. When mapped against Karen's development activities, a clear pattern emerged. Wherever her group showed interest in property, environmental problems mysteriously followed. The breakthrough came when David Chen discovered an encrypted email server used by Karen's inner circle. Sarah had managed to obtain the access credentials during one of Karen's careless moments. The emails revealed conversations about problem, properties, and aggressive solutions, with detailed plans for targeting specific homeowners. James Rodriguez brought in a team of environmental lawyers to review the evidence. The illegal herbicides used on my garden were traced back to a chemical company owned by one of Karen's shell corporations. They had been importing banned substances through a complex network of front companies, specifically for use in their property acquisition schemes. Emma Parker, despite her age, proved to be a masterful investigator. Her years of observing neighborhood dynamics helped us identify patterns we might have missed. She remembered details about previous homeowners who had been forced out, connecting cases that seemed unrelated at first glance. Officer Rodriguez, who had been skeptical of corruption claims initially, now became our strongest ally in law enforcement. She coordinated with state and federal agencies, sharing evidence and building a comprehensive case. The investigation expanded beyond local police jurisdiction as patterns of interstate fraud emerged. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Karen's group had been operating a sophisticated racketeering operation under the guise of community development. They would identify target properties, usually in areas with development potential. The HOA would then be used to harass homeowners with violations and fines while simultaneously devaluing the property through strategic neglect or vandalism. David Chen's financial analysis revealed millions of dollars flowing through a complex network of shell companies. Properties acquired through HOA pressure would be quickly flipped to developers at massive profits. The money would then be laundered through legitimate businesses before being distributed to various conspirators. The investigation uncovered connections to multiple city officials. Karen's network included building inspectors, zoning administrators, and even judges who had ruled in HOA cases. Each had received benefits ranging from cash payments to heavily discounted properties in other developments. Sarah Wilson's position became increasingly dangerous as the investigation progressed. Erin, growing suspicious of information leaks, had installed surveillance software on office computers and hired private investigators to follow board members. Sarah had to become increasingly creative in documenting evidence without detection. The environmental impact assessment of my garden revealed something even more sinister. The herbicides used were part of a calculated strategy to make properties uninhabitable. Similar chemicals had been used in other communities where Karen's group had interests, creating environmental hazards that forced residents to sell. James Rodriguez coordinated with federal investigators as the case expanded. The interstate nature of the fraud, combined with environmental crimes and racketeering, attracted attention from multiple agencies. What had started as a local HOA dispute was now a federal investigation. The investigation faced constant obstacles. Key documents would mysteriously disappear from city archives. Witnesses would suddenly become unavailable or change their stories. Computer systems containing evidence would suffer technical difficulties. Karen's influence reached deep into local infrastructure. Jennifer Hayes began connecting similar cases across the state. Other communities had experienced identical patterns of HOA harassment, environmental vandalism, and forced sales. In each case, shell companies connected to Karen's group had acquired the properties for development. The environmental scientists studying my garden's destruction made a crucial discovery. The chemical formula used in the attack was custom designed to cause maximum damage while mimicking natural causes. This level of sophistication suggested professional involvement and long-term planning. Mike Anderson's construction industry contacts provided valuable insights into Brian Phillips's operation. His company had been systematically underbidding legitimate contractors while cutting corners on materials and safety. The profits were used to fund other aspects of Karen's scheme. David Chen's analysis of property records revealed a pattern of strategic acquisitions. Karen's group had been slowly assembling large blocks of land through individual property purchases, each seemingly unrelated but part of a larger development plan. My garden had been one of the final pieces they needed. The investigation into the environmental crimes led to a disturbing discovery. Karen's group had been testing different chemical combinations in isolated areas, perfecting their method of property destruction. They had turned environmental vandalism into a science, carefully documenting what worked best for forcing sales. Lisa Crawford organized a citizens' investigation committee, coordinating with similar groups in other communities affected by Karen's operations. They created a database of incidents, witnesses, and evidence that proved invaluable to the official investigation. The scale of corruption began to overwhelm even seasoned investigators. Karen's influence extended into multiple government agencies, financial institutions, and development companies. Each new discovery led to more connections, more conspirators, and more crimes. Sarah Wilson's careful documentation proved crucial as the investigation expanded. She had maintained a detailed chronology of decisions, meetings, and communications that showed the deliberate nature of Karen's schemes. Her evidence directly contradicted the legitimate development narrative Karen's lawyers tried to present. Tom Sullivan used his city council position to initiate a formal audit of all development projects approved during Karen's period of influence. The audit revealed numerous irregularities, from missing environmental impact studies to fraudulent property assessments. The investigation faced a major challenge when Karen's group began a coordinated effort to discredit witnesses. Anonymous tips about witnesses' personal lives started appearing in local media. Past legal troubles, financial difficulties, and personal conflicts were exposed in an attempt to undermine testimony. David Chen's financial investigation revealed how Karen had manipulated property values. His analysis showed systematic patterns of artificial devaluation, followed by quick sales to shell companies. The properties would then be immediately revalued at much higher rates for development purposes. The environmental investigation expanded beyond my garden. Similar cases of property destruction were discovered throughout the region, all connected to Karen's development projects. The pattern of environmental vandalism had been refined over years of practice. If you want to know how we use this evidence to finally bring Karen's empire crashing down, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever been part of an investigation that revealed more than you expected. Your stories help others understand the importance of digging deeper. With the investigation providing mountains of evidence, James Rodriguez knew we needed a strategic approach. Simply dumping everything on law enforcement wouldn't be enough. Karen had too many connections, too much influence. We needed a plan that would make it impossible for her to slip away. The first step was organizing the evidence. David Chen created a secure digital database categorizing every document, email, and financial record. He developed a complex system of cross-references, making it easy to track connections between different aspects of Karen's operation. Every piece of evidence was backed up in multiple locations, protected against both digital and physical theft. Jennifer Hayes helped us craft a media strategy. We knew Karen would try to control the narrative once we went public, so we needed to be prepared. Jennifer created detailed press packages, each containing carefully selected evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. She also identified journalists at various news outlets who had previously covered HOA corruption stories. Tom Sullivan worked on the political angle, quietly building support among city council members who hadn't been compromised by Karen's influence. He created a detailed timeline of suspicious zoning changes and permit approvals, showing how Karen's group had manipulated the system. This evidence would be crucial in preventing political interference once we made our move. Sarah Wilson's role became increasingly dangerous as we prepared our case. Karen had become paranoid about leaks, installing new security measures in the HOA office. Sarah had to be incredibly careful about documenting new evidence while maintaining her cover. We set up a complex system of dead drops and encrypted communications to protect her. Mike Anderson used his construction industry connections to identify other victims of Karen's schemes. He found dozens of contractors who had been forced out of business through targeted harassment and permit delays. Each one had a story that fit our emerging pattern, and many were willing to testify about Brian Phillips's role in the corruption. Lisa Crawford organized the community evidence. Her gardening club members had been keeping detailed records of environmental changes throughout the neighborhood. These records provided crucial context, showing how Karen's group had systematically damaged properties they wanted to acquire. The pattern was undeniable when viewed as a whole. Emma Parker became our community liaison, working to keep everyone informed and coordinated without alerting Karen's surveillance. She organized small group meetings disguised as social gatherings where we could safely share information and gather new evidence. Her age and seemingly harmless demeanor made her the perfect cover for these activities. Officer Rodriguez helped us prepare our evidence for criminal prosecution. She advised us on what would be admissible in court and how to document chain of custody for physical evidence. She also coordinated with state and federal agencies, ensuring our case would be taken seriously at all levels of law enforcement. The environmental evidence required special handling. The scientists studying the destruction of my garden helped us prepare detailed reports showing the deliberate nature of the attack. They documented how the chemicals used were specifically chosen for maximum damage, proving this wasn't a random act of vandalism but a calculated strategy. James Rodriguez developed a multi-pronged legal strategy. We would need to file civil suits, criminal complaints, and regulatory challenges simultaneously to prevent Karen from using her influence to block any single approach. He prepared separate cases for different jurisdictions, ensuring that if one was blocked, others would still proceed. David Chen's financial analysis became the backbone of our case. He created detailed flowcharts showing how money moved through Karen's network of shell companies. The pattern of fraud was clear. Properties would be devalued through HOA harassment, purchased at low prices, and quickly flipped for massive profits through pre-arranged deals. We needed to protect our evidence. Karen had already demonstrated her willingness to destroy anything that threatened her position. We created multiple backups of everything, stored in secure locations. Each team member knew only their part of the storage system, ensuring no single person could compromise the entire case. The timing of our move would be crucial. We needed to coordinate with multiple agencies and media outlets to prevent Karen from using her influence to shut us down. Jennifer Hayes developed a detailed timeline for releasing information, ensuring maximum impact and minimum opportunity for interference. Sarah Wilson's position became even more precarious as we prepared to move. Karen had started conducting random searches of employee belongings and monitoring all communications. Sarah had to find increasingly creative ways to document new evidence. Without detection, she began using a complex system of coded messages hidden in routine paperwork. The environmental scientists helped us prepare for the inevitable challenges to their findings. They documented every step of their analysis, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence showing the deliberate nature of the chemical attacks. Their reports would be crucial in proving the systematic nature of Karen's property destruction scheme. Mike Anderson discovered something crucial through his industry contacts. Karen's group had been using similar tactics in other communities, always following the same pattern. He found contractors who had been forced to participate in property destruction schemes, each one providing another piece of evidence for our case. The community response required careful management. People were angry about the destruction of my garden and other properties, but we needed to channel that anger constructively. Emma Parker organized support groups where people could share information safely while documenting new instances of harassment or vandalism. James Rodriguez prepared for Karen's inevitable legal counterattack. He anticipated every possible defense and prepared responses backed by solid evidence. He also identified potential witnesses who could testify about similar schemes in other communities, showing this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of criminal behavior. The financial evidence was particularly damning. David Chen had traced millions of dollars flowing through Karen's network of shell companies. Each transaction was documented, showing how properties acquired through HOA pressure were quickly flipped for massive profits. The money trail led to offshore accounts and hidden assets that Karen had tried to conceal. Lisa Crawford's gardening club records proved invaluable in establishing the timeline of environmental attacks. Their detailed documentation of plant, diseases and soil conditions showed how Karen's group had systematically damaged properties they wanted to acquire. The pattern was clear when viewed across multiple properties and years. Officer Rodriguez helped us prepare for potential interference. From corrupt law enforcement officials, she identified trusted officers in various agencies who could help protect our investigation. She also advised us on securing our evidence against potential theft or destruction. The media strategy required careful coordination. Jennifer Hayes had identified journalists at various outlets who could be trusted to report the story accurately. She prepared different packages of evidence for each one, ensuring the story would break simultaneously through multiple channels. Tom Sullivan worked on securing political support for our case. He found council members and state representatives who hadn't been compromised by Karen's influence. Their support would be crucial in preventing political interference once we went public. The environmental evidence was organized into clear, compelling presentations. The scientists helped us explain complex chemical analyses in ways that would be understood by the general public. Their reports showed conclusively that the attacks on properties were deliberate and coordinated. Sarah Wilson's documentation of HOA board meetings and decisions provided the framework for our case. Her careful notes showed how Karen had manipulated the system, using HOA regulations as weapons against property owners who refused to sell. Emma Parker organized a network of community observers who could document any retaliation once we went public. Each person was assigned specific areas to monitor, creating a comprehensive surveillance system that would catch any attempts at intimidation or vandalism. The legal strategy was refined and tested. James Rodriguez conducted mock trials, anticipating every possible defense Karen might use. He prepared responses backed by solid evidence, ensuring we could counter any attempt to discredit our case. If you want to know how we finally put this plan into action and brought Karen's corruption to light, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever been part of planning a major exposure of corruption. Your stories help others understand the importance of thorough preparation. The morning of our planned reveal started quietly. Too quietly. The calm before the storm, as they say. I remember standing in what remained of my garden, watching the sunrise and knowing that by sunset, nothing would be the same. James Rodriguez had chosen this day carefully, a Tuesday when both the City Council and the HOA board had scheduled meetings. Jennifer Hayes had coordinated with 5 different news outlets, timing their stories to break simultaneously at exactly 9 a.m. Each outlet had received a different piece of the puzzle, ensuring that the full scope of Karen's corruption would emerge through multiple sources. As the stories went live, our phones began buzzing with notifications. The first story focused on the environmental crimes, detailing how Karen's group had systematically destroyed properties using illegal chemicals. Security camera footage of my garden's destruction played on local news, followed by forensic analysis proving the deliberate nature of the attack. The scientists' reports left no doubt. This was premeditated environmental vandalism. The second outlet revealed the financial web David Chen had uncovered. They published flowcharts showing how money moved through Karen's shell companies, documenting millions in fraudulent property transactions. The complex network of offshore accounts and hidden assets was laid bare for everyone to see. The third story exposed the political corruption, revealing how Karen's husband had manipulated zoning laws and property valuations from his position in the city planning office. Tom Sullivan provided documentation showing how legitimate development proposals had been blocked while Karen's projects were fast-tracked. Sarah Wilson chose this moment to make her move. During the HOA board meeting, she stood up and publicly presented evidence of Karen's manipulation of board votes and misuse of HOA funds. The other board members sat in stunned silence as Sarah methodically exposed years of financial fraud and abuse of power. Karen's reaction was exactly as we had anticipated. She tried to shut down the board meeting, claiming unauthorized disruption, but the room was already full of homeowners demanding answers. The carefully crafted image she had maintained for years crumbled as she faced direct questions about specific fraudulent transactions. Mike Anderson's construction industry contacts came forward en masse, describing how they had been forced to participate in Karen's schemes or face financial ruin. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic intimidation and corruption that had poisoned the entire local development industry. The environmental scientists held a press conference on the steps of City Hall, presenting their analysis of the chemical attacks on multiple properties. They explained in clear terms how the specific combinations of herbicides used could only have been chosen by someone with expert knowledge and criminal intent. Lisa Crawford organized a community walkthrough of affected properties, showing journalists and investigators the pattern of environmental destruction that had followed Karen's development interests. The Garden Club's meticulous records provided irrefutable evidence of coordinated attacks on targeted properties. By noon, Karen's lawyers were already issuing desperate statements, trying to dismiss the evidence as a coordinated smear campaign. But they hadn't anticipated the volume and quality of evidence we had accumulated. Every time they denied one allegation, 3 more pieces of evidence would emerge to support it. Brian Phillips cracked under the pressure. Faced with multiple criminal charges and civil lawsuits, he agreed to cooperate with investigators. His testimony confirmed what we had suspected. Karen had been the mastermind behind the entire operation, using her HOA position as a cover for large-scale fraud and property theft. The city council meeting that afternoon became a public forum for grievances against Karen's regime. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories of harassment, intimidation, and property damage. Tom Sullivan ensured that every testimony was officially recorded and entered into public record. Emma Parker's network of community observers documented Karen's increasingly erratic behavior as the day progressed. They watched as she made frantic phone calls, rushed between meetings with lawyers, and finally returned to the HOA office where she began shredding documents in a desperate attempt to destroy evidence. Officer Rodriguez was waiting for her there, armed with a search warrant. The attempted destruction of evidence became another charge in the growing list of criminal complaints. The HOA office was sealed as a crime scene, with forensic accountants beginning the task of reconstructing financial records. James Rodriguez filed multiple lawsuits simultaneously, targeting not just Karen, but every member of her corrupt network. The legal documents detailed specific instances of fraud, environmental crimes, and racketeering, supported by thousands of pages of evidence. Karen's political allies began distancing themselves as the scope of her crimes became clear. City officials who had previously supported her development projects suddenly became cooperative with investigators, eager to avoid being implicated in her schemes. By late afternoon, federal agents had arrived to take control of the investigation. The interstate nature of the financial crimes and environmental violations had attracted attention from multiple agencies. Karen's empire was being dismantled piece by piece, with each new revelation leading to more evidence of corruption. The media coverage was relentless. Jennifer Hayes's careful planning ensured that new aspects of the story emerged throughout the day, preventing Karen's team from effectively responding to any single allegation. The public narrative was firmly under our control. Sarah Wilson's role as a whistleblower made her an instant media sensation. Her detailed documentation of HOA corruption became a template for investigating similar schemes in other communities. She began receiving calls from homeowners across the country who recognized the pattern she described. The environmental impact of Karen's crimes became a major focus of public attention. Scientists estimated it would take years to fully remediate the damage caused by her group's chemical attacks. The cost of environmental cleanup would run into millions of dollars. David Chen's financial analysis revealed the true scale of Karen's operation. The property scheme had generated over $20 million in fraudulent profits, all carefully hidden through a network of shell companies and fake transactions. The forensic accounting trail was damning. Local businesses began coming forward with their own stories of intimidation and corruption. Karen's influence had extended far beyond property development, creating a climate of fear that had stifled legitimate business growth in the community. By evening, Karen's lawyer issued a statement announcing her resignation from the HOA board, claiming health reasons. But it was too late. The evidence of her crimes was already public, and multiple agencies were preparing criminal charges. The community gathered that night in what remained of my garden. What had started as a simple property dispute had exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for years. People shared stories, compared experiences, and began planning for the future. Lisa Crawford announced plans for a community restoration project aimed at rehabilitating all the properties damaged by Karen's group. The Garden Club would lead efforts to document and repair environmental damage, creating a model for other communities facing similar challenges. James Rodriguez worked late into the night, coordinating with law enforcement agencies and preparing for the next phase of legal action. The evidence we had gathered would support multiple criminal prosecutions and civil lawsuits. The national media picked up the story, focusing on how a small community had exposed and defeated a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Our experience became a case study in fighting corruption at the local level. If you want to know what happened next, how Karen tried to escape justice, and how our community began to heal, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever been part of exposing corruption in your community. Your stories inspire others to stand up against abuse of power. The morning after our public reveal, Karen Mitchell was nowhere to be found. Her house stood empty, her expensive car gone from the driveway. James Rodriguez had anticipated this. We had already provided law enforcement with a list of her known properties and likely escape routes. Her attempt to flee would only add to the charges against her. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Within hours of Karen's disappearance, agents were executing search warrants at multiple locations simultaneously. They raided the HOA office, Karen's home, Brian Phillips's construction company, and several other properties connected to their operation. What they found exceeded even our expectations. Hidden in a false wall of Karen's home office, investigators discovered hard drives containing years of detailed records. Every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated vote, every targeted property. Karen's meticulous documentation of her own crimes would prove to be her undoing. Sarah Wilson's testimony became crucial to the prosecution's case. She provided context for every document, explaining how Karen had systematically corrupted the HOA's processes. Her insider knowledge helped investigators understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Brian Phillips proved to be the weak link in Karen's network. Faced with overwhelming evidence and potential decades in prison, he began cooperating fully with investigators. His testimony revealed that Karen's operation extended far beyond our community, with similar schemes running in multiple states. The Environmental Crimes Task Force made a stunning discovery in Brian Phillips's warehouse. They found a stockpile of illegal herbicides, along with detailed records of their use in property destruction schemes. The evidence directly linked Karen's group to environmental attacks in several communities. David Chen's financial analysis took on new significance as federal investigators followed the money trail. The $20 million we had initially uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The total fraud amounted to over $50 million, spread across multiple states and dozens of shell companies. Tom Sullivan used his position on the city council to initiate a comprehensive audit of all development projects approved during Karen's reign. The audit revealed a pattern of corruption that had cost the community millions in lost revenue and environmental damage. Officer Rodriguez coordinated with federal agents as they built their criminal case. The evidence we had gathered provided the foundation, but the federal investigation uncovered layers of corruption we hadn't even suspected. Karen's influence had extended into state agencies and regulatory bodies. The arrest finally came 3 days later. Karen was found at a small private airfield, attempting to charter a flight to a non-extradition country. The federal agents who arrested her found another cache of incriminating documents in her luggage. She'd been planning this escape for months. The arraignment was a media spectacle. Jennifer Hayes ensured that every detail was covered, from Karen's designer outfit turned prison jumpsuit to her uncharacteristically disheveled appearance in court. The woman who had terrorized our community for years finally looked vulnerable. The charges against Karen read like a criminal law textbook: racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, money laundering, and dozens of other federal and state violations. Each charge was supported by mountains of evidence, much of it from Karen's own records. James Rodriguez worked closely with federal prosecutors to ensure every detail was properly handled. The case had to be airtight. Karen had resources and connections, and we couldn't risk her finding a legal loophole to escape justice. The plea negotiations revealed the extent of Karen's network. In exchange for consideration in sentencing, she provided information about corrupt officials and business leaders who had participated in her schemes. The investigation expanded to include dozens of new targets. Mike Anderson's construction industry contacts proved invaluable as investigators unraveled the broader conspiracy. They found that Karen's group had been systematically eliminating competition through permit manipulation and regulatory harassment, controlling entire sectors of the local economy. Lisa Crawford organized community impact statements for the prosecution. Hundreds of residents came forward to describe how Karen's corruption had affected their lives. The stories painted a picture of a community held hostage by systematic abuse of power. The environmental assessment of damaged properties became a key part of the prosecution's case. Scientists documented the long-term effects of Karen's chemical attacks, showing how her group had deliberately caused lasting environmental harm to force property sales. Emma Parker's careful documentation of community harassment proved crucial in establishing the pattern of intimidation. Her record showed how Karen had used HOA authority to target specific properties, creating a climate of fear that served her criminal enterprise. The federal investigation revealed connections to similar schemes in other states. Karen's model of using HOA authority for property theft had been replicated in multiple communities, creating a network of corruption that spanned several jurisdictions. Sarah Wilson's testimony before the grand jury lasted 3 days. She provided detailed accounts of how Karen had manipulated HOA processes, falsified records, and orchestrated the harassment of property owners who refused to sell. Her evidence was instrumental in securing indictments. The scale of financial fraud emerged as forensic accountants dug deeper into Karen's records. They found that she had been running a sophisticated money laundering operation, using property transactions to clean millions in illicit profits from various criminal enterprises. Brian Phillips's cooperation led investigators to other construction companies involved in the scheme. Each new discovery revealed another layer of corruption, showing how Karen had created a virtual monopoly on local development through intimidation and fraud. The environmental crimes investigation expanded as more properties were tested. The pattern of chemical attacks was consistent across multiple communities, showing a coordinated effort to devalue properties through environmental damage. Tom Sullivan's City Council investigation revealed how Karen had manipulated zoning laws and building codes to serve her criminal enterprise. The evidence showed years of systematic corruption in local government, with officials either complicit or coerced into cooperation. The case sparked investigations in other communities where Karen's group had operated. Similar patterns of HOA abuse and property theft emerged, suggesting a broader criminal conspiracy that had gone undetected for years. James Rodriguez coordinated with prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions as the case expanded. The evidence we had gathered in our community helped other prosecutors build cases against Karen's associates in their jurisdictions. The federal investigation uncovered offshore accounts containing millions in stolen profits. The money trail led to tax havens around the world, revealing the international scope of Karen's financial crimes. Lisa Crawford's Garden Club records became crucial evidence in the environmental crimes case. Their detailed documentation of plant deaths and soil contamination helped prosecutors establish the timeline of Karen's chemical attacks. The prosecution's case was strengthened by Karen's own meticulous record-keeping. She had documented every aspect of her criminal enterprise, apparently never believing she would be caught. Her detailed records made it impossible for her to claim ignorance or deny involvement. The impact on our community continued to unfold. As the legal proceedings progressed, property values began to recover as Karen's corrupt influence was removed. Legitimate businesses returned to the area, and the climate of fear gradually lifted. If you want to know how the community began to heal and rebuild after Karen's arrest, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever witnessed justice finally catching up with corruption. Your stories remind us that the legal system can work when communities stand together. 1 year after Karen's arrest, I stood in my garden again, but this time I wasn't alone. Dozens of community members worked alongside me, helping to restore what had been destroyed. The soil remediation experts had finally cleared the ground for replanting, and the whole neighborhood had turned out to help rebuild. Lisa Crawford led the restoration effort, using her gardening club's expertise to plan a new kind of community garden. Where Karen had tried to destroy nature to build concrete, we created something even more beautiful than before. The new design incorporated elements from everyone's cultural backgrounds, creating a true reflection of our diverse community. Emma Parker, who had been instrumental in exposing Karen's corruption, now taught gardening classes to neighborhood children in the restored space. The kids learned not just about plants, but about standing up for what's right and the importance of community. The garden became a living classroom, teaching lessons that went far beyond horticulture. Sarah Wilson, no longer burdened by the secret knowledge of corruption, started a community oversight program. Her experience as a whistleblower taught us the importance of transparency in local governance. The program became a model for other communities, showing how engaged citizens could prevent the abuse of power. Mike Anderson's construction company led the effort to rebuild damaged properties throughout the neighborhood. But this time, everything was done openly and honestly. Each project included community input and environmental considerations. The transformation wasn't just physical. It represented a new way of doing business. The HOA itself underwent a complete restructuring. Tom Sullivan helped draft new bylaws that emphasized transparency and community involvement. Regular audits and term limits became mandatory. The organization that Karen had used as a weapon became a tool for positive change, focused on true community enhancement rather than control. James Rodriguez didn't stop with Karen's conviction. He worked with state legislators to draft new laws protecting homeowners from HOA abuse. The Garden Protection Act, as it came to be known, set clear limits on HOA authority and established strong penalties for using environmental vandalism as a development tactic. Jennifer Hayes documented our community's transformation for a series of special reports. The stories weren't just about exposing corruption anymore. They showed how communities could rebuild and thrive after breaking free from corrupt leadership. Our experience became a blueprint for other neighborhoods facing similar challenges. The environmental scientists who had helped expose Karen's crimes continued to monitor the soil recovery. They used our garden as a case study in environmental remediation, showing how communities could heal both their land and their social bonds after environmental attacks. Their research helped other communities dealing with similar issues. David Chen's financial expertise proved valuable in setting up a new community development fund. The money recovered from Karen's criminal enterprise was used to support local improvement projects with transparent oversight and community input on every decision. The fund became a model for ethical community development. Officer Rodriguez worked with us to establish a new community policing program. The relationships built during our fight against corruption formed the foundation for better communication between law enforcement and residents. Regular meetings and open dialogue replaced the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had existed under Karen's regime. The Butterfly Garden, once the first target of Karen's destruction, became a symbol of our renewal. As native plants returned and monarchs once again filled the air, we added a small plaque telling our story. It reminded visitors that beauty can return after destruction, and that communities are stronger than corruption. The City Council, under Tom Sullivan's leadership, established new procedures for development projects. Every proposal now required environmental impact studies and genuine community input. The fast-track approvals and backroom deals that had characterized Karen's era were replaced with transparent processes and public accountability. Lisa Crawford's gardening club expanded its mission, becoming a force for community education and environmental advocacy. They worked with local schools to create garden programs, teaching children about sustainable practices and community involvement. The lessons went beyond gardening to include civic responsibility and environmental stewardship. The legal aftermath of Karen's conviction continued to ripple through the community. As more of her associates faced justice, each case brought new opportunities for reform. The court-ordered restitution funds were used to support community improvement projects, turning the profits of corruption into tools for positive change. Sarah Wilson's documentation of Karen's crimes became required reading for HOA board members across the state. Her detailed records showed how corruption could take root in seemingly ordinary organizations, and how vigilant community oversight was essential to preventing abuse of power. The environmental restoration became a community-wide effort. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment. Neighbors volunteered their time and skills. Even people who had once supported Karen joined in, recognizing that the community's healing required everyone's participation. Mike Anderson's experience led him to establish a mentorship program for young contractors. He taught them not just construction skills, but ethical business practices and the importance of community involvement. The program helped create a new generation of developers committed to responsible growth. The transformation affected every aspect of community life. Property values stabilized, but not through manipulation and fraud. Instead, genuine improvements and strong community bonds made our neighborhood desirable. People wanted to live here because of what we had become, not what we appeared to be. James Rodriguez continued to advise other communities facing similar challenges. The legal strategies we had used to expose Karen's corruption became a template for fighting HOA abuse nationwide. Our story showed that determined residents could successfully challenge entrenched corruption. The garden itself evolved into something more than just a collection of plants. It became a living memorial to community resilience. Each section told a story. The butterfly garden represented renewal. The vegetable beds showed the importance of sharing resources, and the community gathering spaces demonstrated the power of unity. Emma Parker's role shifted from observer to teacher. She shared her experience with other community activists, showing how seemingly powerless residents could gather evidence and build cases against corruption. Her methods became part of training programs for community organizers across the country. The environmental scientists continued to monitor our progress, documenting how the land recovered from Karen's chemical attacks. Their research provided valuable data for other communities dealing with environmental vandalism, showing that restoration was possible even after severe damage. Jennifer Hayes's ongoing coverage of our transformation inspired other communities to examine their own power structures. Our story showed that positive change was possible, even in situations that seemed hopeless. The media attention helped spread our methods and lessons to other neighborhoods. The new HOA structure proved that community organizations could operate transparently and ethically. Regular meetings became opportunities for genuine discussion rather than displays of power. Community members felt heard and valued rather than controlled and threatened. David Chen's financial oversight systems were adopted by other HOAs, creating a standard for transparent community finance. The mechanisms he developed to track and prevent fraud became tools for protecting other communities from corruption. The Garden Protection Act inspired similar legislation in other states. Our experience showed how local corruption could be fought through legal reform and how environmental protection could be strengthened through community action. Officer Rodriguez's community policing program demonstrated how law enforcement and residents could work together effectively. The trust built during our struggle against corruption created lasting partnerships that made our neighborhood safer and more connected. As our story comes to an end, I want to share one final image. Last week, I watched a new family move into our neighborhood. Their children ran straight to the butterfly garden, chasing monarchs and asking questions about the plants. Their parents were welcomed by neighbors who shared our story and invited them to join our community activities. This is the legacy of our struggle, not just the defeat of corruption, but the creation of something beautiful and lasting in its place. Today, 5 years after Karen Mitchell's conviction, I want to share with you the lasting changes that transformed not just our community, but inspired a nationwide movement against HOA corruption. The impact of our struggle reached far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The garden that Karen tried to destroy has become something extraordinary. What started as my personal project has evolved into the Willow Creek Community Gardens network, spanning over 20 acres across our neighborhood. The original butterfly garden now serves as the centerpiece of a larger ecosystem restoration project that attracts researchers and environmental experts from across the country. The transformation began slowly at first. Lisa Crawford's gardening club expanded their focus to include environmental education. They partnered with local schools to create a comprehensive curriculum about sustainable gardening practices and ecosystem restoration. Today, every elementary school student in our district spends time learning in these gardens, understanding both the science of plants and the importance of community stewardship. Emma Parker's role evolved far beyond her initial community watchdog position. She established the Senior Citizens Environmental Monitoring Program, which has been replicated in over 50 communities nationwide. The program combines the observational skills of retired residents with modern environmental monitoring technology, creating an effective early warning system for environmental violations. Sarah Wilson's whistleblower experience led to the creation of the Community Governance Transparency Initiative. The program, now operating in 12 states, provides training and support for HOA board members and residents alike. Their motto, "Sunshine is the best disinfectant," reflects their commitment to preventing corruption through absolute transparency in community governance. Mike Anderson's construction company became a model for ethical development practices. He created an apprenticeship program teaching sustainable building techniques and ethical business practices to young contractors. The program has graduated over 300 students, many of whom have gone on to establish their own ethical construction companies, slowly transforming the industry from within. The legal framework James Rodriguez helped establish has had far-reaching effects. The Garden Protection Act, initially passed in our state, has now been adopted in various forms by 27 other states. The legislation not only protects community gardens, but establishes strict guidelines for HOA, governance and environmental protection. Tom Sullivan's work on the City Council led to the creation of the Community Development Ethics Board, a model that has been adopted by municipalities across the country. The board ensures that development projects undergo rigorous environmental and community impact assessments before approval, preventing the kind of corrupt fast-tracking that Karen's group had exploited. Jennifer Hayes's documentation of our story sparked a national conversation about HOA reform. Her series of reports won several journalism awards and led to the creation of a nationwide database tracking HOA violations and corruption cases. The database has become an essential tool for community activists and investigators. The environmental scientists who studied the chemical attack on my garden established the Environmental Vandalism Research Center at the State University. Their work has led to improved detection methods for environmental crimes and better restoration techniques for damaged ecosystems. The center provides free consulting services to communities facing similar challenges. David Chen's financial investigation methods have become standard practice in HOA forensic audits. He developed a comprehensive training program teaching community treasurers how to identify and prevent financial fraud. The program has helped uncover dozens of similar schemes across the country, preventing millions in potential losses. Officer Rodriguez's community policing model has been adopted by police departments nationwide. The program emphasizes collaboration between law enforcement and community organizations in preventing and investigating environmental crimes. It has led to a significant increase in successful prosecutions of environmental vandalism cases. The Butterfly Gardens restoration became a symbol of environmental resilience. Scientists discovered that some plants had developed resistance to the chemicals Karen's group had used, leading to breakthrough research in ecosystem recovery. The resistant plants are now being used in other restoration projects around the world. Lisa Crawford's original gardening club evolved into the Community Environmental Protection Network, with chapters in over 200 cities. The network provides resources and support for communities fighting environmental vandalism and development-related corruption. Their annual conference has become a major event in the environmental protection movement. The impact on local government has been profound. Our city now requires environmental impact studies for all development projects, with particular attention to existing green spaces and community gardens. The planning process includes mandatory community consultation periods and transparent review procedures. The HOA industry itself has undergone significant changes. Our case led to the creation of the National HOA Reform Coalition, which advocates for stronger oversight and resident protections. Many HOAs have adopted our transparency models and educational programs, creating a new standard for community governance. Mike Anderson's documentation of construction industry corruption helped expose similar schemes nationwide. His testimony before state legislatures led to stricter licensing requirements for developers and mandatory ethics training for construction company owners. The industry is slowly shifting toward more sustainable and community-friendly practices. The environmental monitoring system we developed has been refined and expanded. Residents use a combination of soil testing kits, wildlife surveys, and plant health indicators to track ecosystem health. The data feeds into a national database, helping identify patterns of environmental crime and natural habitat changes. Sarah Wilson's detailed records of HOA corruption became the foundation for a college course on community governance ethics. The course is now mandatory for urban planning students at several universities, ensuring future community leaders understand the importance of transparent and ethical management. The financial recovery methods David Chen developed have helped other communities reclaim funds lost to corruption. His forensic accounting techniques have been adopted by law enforcement agencies investigating similar cases. The methods have led to the recovery of over $100 million in stolen community assets nationwide. Jennifer Hayes's media coverage guidelines for community corruption cases have become standard practice in investigative journalism. Her emphasis on thorough documentation and community perspective has changed how these stories are reported. giving more voice to affected residents and highlighting systemic issues. The Garden Protection Act's influence continues to grow. Recent amendments have strengthened environmental protection measures and increased penalties for HOA corruption. The Act now includes provisions for community garden preservation and mandatory environmental impact studies for development projects. Tom Sullivan's work on development oversight has led to the creation of regional planning ethics committees. These committees review large-scale development proposals for potential conflicts of interest and environmental impacts, preventing the kind of corrupt schemes Karen's group had operated. The community healing process we pioneered has been studied and replicated in other areas recovering from corruption. Mental health professionals have documented the importance of community rebuilding projects in restoring trust and social bonds. Our garden restoration project is often cited as a model for community healing. The educational programs developed in our community gardens have expanded beyond environmental science. Students now learn about civic responsibility, community organizing, and the importance of environmental protection. The curriculum has been adopted by schools across the country. The impact on property values has been significant, but not in the way Karen had envisioned. Our community's emphasis on sustainable development and environmental protection has attracted residents who value these principles. Property values have increased steadily, driven by genuine improvements rather than manipulated markets. The scientific research sparked by our case continues to yield important discoveries. The relationship between community gardens and social resilience has become a major field of study. Researchers have documented how shared green spaces strengthen community bonds and improve quality of life. The legal precedents established in our case have influenced court decisions nationwide. Judges now review HOA actions with greater scrutiny, particularly in cases involving environmental impact or community resources. The burden of proof has shifted, requiring HOAs to justify actions affecting community spaces. The ripple effects began when Jennifer Hayes' coverage of our story went viral. Within months, homeowners from across the country started reaching out, sharing similar experiences with corrupt HOAs and development schemes. A pattern emerged. What happened to my garden wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a widespread problem that needed addressing. James Rodriguez found himself overwhelmed with requests for legal guidance from communities facing similar challenges. He partnered with law schools across the country to create the Community Property Rights Clinic program. These clinics now operate in 37 states, providing free legal support to homeowners fighting HOA abuse and corrupt development practices. The Garden Protection Act caught the attention of federal legislators. Senator Rachel Thompson, no relation, used our case as the foundation for the National Housing Community Rights Bill. The legislation, currently moving through Congress, would establish federal oversight of HOAs and create strict penalties for using environmental vandalism as a development tactic. Sarah Wilson's whistleblower experience led to the creation of the National HOA Whistleblower Protection Network. The organization provides legal support, security resources, and counseling services to HOA employees who come forward with evidence of corruption. Their hotline has received over 10,000 calls in the past year alone. David Chen's financial investigation methods became the basis for a nationwide forensic accounting program specializing in HOA fraud. The program has trained over 500 accountants in detecting and preventing the kind of financial schemes Karen's group had perfected. Their work has already uncovered similar fraud patterns in hundreds of communities. The environmental scientists who studied our garden's destruction established the National Environmental Vandalism Database. This comprehensive resource tracks cases of deliberate environmental damage used as a development tactic. The database has become an essential tool for law enforcement and environmental protection agencies across the country. Mike Anderson's construction industry reforms spread through professional networks nationwide. His ethical development guidelines have been adopted by major construction associations, leading to industry-wide changes in how development projects are approached. The emphasis on community involvement and environmental protection has become standard practice. Lisa Crawford's Community Garden Network expanded into the National Garden Protection Alliance. The organization now connects over 5,000 community gardens across the country, providing resources for environmental protection, legal defense, and sustainable development. Their annual conference draws participants from every state. Emma Parker's Senior Citizen Monitoring Program evolved into the National Community Watch Network. The program combines traditional neighborhood watch activities with environmental monitoring and corporate accountability. Their mobile app has been downloaded over 1 million times, creating a nationwide network of community observers. Tom Sullivan's work on development oversight inspired similar reforms in municipalities across the country. His model for community involvement in development decisions has been adopted by hundreds of cities. The emphasis on transparency and environmental impact assessment has changed how urban development projects are approved. The environmental restoration techniques developed in our garden have been refined and standardized. The National Environmental Restoration Protocol, based on our experience, provides communities with step-by-step guidance for recovering from chemical damage and other forms of environmental vandalism. The protocol has been used in over 300 restoration projects nationwide. Jennifer Hayes' reporting guidelines for covering community corruption have been adopted by journalism schools nationwide. Her emphasis on thorough documentation and community perspective has changed how these stories are investigated and reported. The guidelines are now part of standard curriculum in investigative journalism programs. The legal precedents established, in our case, have influenced court decisions across the country. The Willow Creek Standard, as it's come to be known in legal circles, requires HOAs to prove their actions serve legitimate community interests rather than private development schemes. This shift in burden of proof has strengthened homeowner protections nationwide. The Community Governance Transparency Initiative that grew from our experience has spread to over 500 HOAs nationwide. Their certification program sets strict standards for financial transparency, community involvement, and environmental protection. HOAs that meet these standards see increased property values and community satisfaction. The National HOA Reform Coalition, inspired by our fight, has become a powerful advocacy force. They've successfully lobbied for stronger oversight and resident protections in 43 states. Their work has led to significant changes in how HOAs are regulated and operated across the country. The environmental education program developed in our community gardens has been adapted for schools nationwide. The curriculum, which combines science education with civic responsibility and environmental protection, is now used in over 2,000 schools. The program has created a new generation of environmentally conscious community leaders. The financial recovery methods David Chen developed have been adopted by law enforcement agencies nationwide. His techniques for tracing hidden assets and exposing shell companies have become standard practice in investigating HOA fraud. The methods have led to the recovery of billions in stolen community assets. The community policing model officer Rodriguez developed has transformed how law enforcement approaches HOA disputes. Her emphasis on prevention and community involvement has been adopted by police departments across the country. The model has led to more successful investigations and prosecutions of HOA-related crimes. The scientific research sparked by our case has grown into a major field of study. Universities across the country have established programs focusing on community resilience and environmental protection. The relationship between community gardens and social stability has become a recognized area of academic research. The impact on property rights legislation has been significant. 27 states have passed versions of the Garden Protection Act, creating stronger safeguards against HOA overreach and environmental vandalism. These laws have fundamentally changed the balance of power between HOAs and homeowners. The National Community Development Ethics Board, modeled after our local reforms, now reviews major development projects across the country. Their certification has become a mark of legitimacy in the development industry, helping prevent the kind of corrupt schemes Karen's group had operated. The movement continues to grow. Every week brings news of another community using our experience to fight corruption or protect their environment. The network of activated citizens and reformed institutions grows stronger with each success story. Now, I want to share something unexpected: how our local garden fight in Willow Creek Estates sparked changes that reached far beyond American borders. What began as a conflict with Karen Mitchell's corrupt HOA has inspired movements for community rights and environmental protection around the world. The international impact began when Jennifer Hayes's coverage caught the attention of environmental activists in Europe. They recognized similar patterns of development-driven environmental vandalism in their communities. Our documentation methods and resistance strategies provided a template for their own fights against corruption. James Rodriguez found himself consulting with legal experts from Canada, the UK, and Australia. Each country had its own version of HOA-style organizations, and each faced similar challenges with corruption and abuse of power. The legal framework we developed became a model for reform efforts worldwide. The environmental scientists who studied the chemical attack on my garden connected with researchers globally. Their findings about soil restoration and ecosystem recovery proved valuable in addressing similar cases of environmental vandalism worldwide. The research led to the creation of the International Environmental Vandalism Research Network. Sarah Wilson's whistleblower protection protocols have been adapted for use in countries around the world. Her methods for documenting corruption while maintaining personal safety became part of international whistleblower protection guidelines. The protocols have helped expose similar schemes across multiple continents. David Chen's financial investigation techniques attracted attention from international anti-corruption organizations. His methods for tracking hidden assets and exposing shell companies proved effective in fighting development-related corruption globally. Financial investigators from dozens of countries have adopted his approaches. The Butterfly Garden's resurrection became a symbol of environmental resilience internationally. Environmental groups from South America to Asia have used our restoration techniques to recover damaged ecosystems. The garden's design has been replicated in communities facing similar challenges worldwide. Lisa Crawford's Community Garden Network expanded internationally through social media. Her methods for organizing community resistance and environmental protection have been translated into 27 languages. The network now connects community gardens and environmental activists worldwide. Emma Parker's Senior Citizen Monitoring Program found unexpected success in Japan, where an aging population embraced the opportunity to protect their communities. The program has been adapted to fit different cultural contexts while maintaining its core mission of community oversight and environmental protection. Tom Sullivan's development oversight reforms caught the attention of urban planners internationally. His model for community involvement in development decisions has influenced urban planning policies in cities around the world. The emphasis on transparency and environmental impact has become part of global best practices. The environmental restoration techniques developed in our garden have been applied to cases of environmental vandalism worldwide. From illegal logging sites in Southeast Asia to damaged urban gardens in European cities, our methods have helped communities recover from environmental attacks. Jennifer Hayes's reporting guidelines have been adopted by journalists internationally. Her approach to investigating and documenting community corruption has influenced environmental journalism worldwide. The guidelines have been incorporated into journalism training programs across multiple continents. The legal precedents established in our case have influenced property rights legislation globally. Countries developing new property laws have studied our case as an example of balancing development needs with community rights and environmental protection. The principles we fought for have shaped international property rights discussions. The Community Governance Transparency Initiative has evolved into an international movement. Communities from South Africa to New Zealand have adapted our transparency protocols to fight corruption in their local governance structures. The initiative has become a global standard for community organization. Mike Anderson's ethical development guidelines have been embraced by international construction associations. His emphasis on community involvement and environmental protection has influenced development practices worldwide. The guidelines have been adapted to address different cultural and regulatory contexts. The scientific research sparked by our case has grown into a global field of study. Universities worldwide are studying the relationship between community gardens, social resilience, and resistance to corruption. Our experience has become a case study in environmental justice and community empowerment. The financial recovery methods David Chen developed have been used to investigate corruption cases internationally. His techniques have helped expose similar development schemes in countries around the world. The methods have become part of the international anti-corruption toolkit. The community policing model Officer Rodriguez developed has influenced law enforcement approaches globally. Her emphasis on prevention and community involvement has been adapted for use in different cultural contexts. The model has improved how communities worldwide work with law enforcement to fight corruption. The environmental education program developed in our gardens has been translated and adapted for schools worldwide. The curriculum now includes perspectives from different cultures and ecosystems. Students around the world are learning about environmental protection and community activism through our experience. The impact on international property rights has been profound. Our case has been cited in property rights discussions from the European Union to the United Nations. The principles we fought for have influenced how communities worldwide protect their rights against corrupt development. The National Community Development Ethics Board has evolved into an international organization. Their standards for ethical development have been adopted by communities worldwide. The certification process has become a global benchmark for responsible development practices. If you want to learn how communities around the world are adapting our methods to their unique challenges, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below if you've seen similar changes in your country. Your stories help us understand the global impact of local action. Up next, you'll see two fascinating stories about international community transformation. The first shows how a neighborhood in Barcelona used our methods to protect their historic gardens. And the second reveals how residents in Melbourne adapted our transparency protocols to their local context. Click either video to explore more inspiring stories of global change. Thank you for being part of this worldwide movement, and remember that local action can create global change. Together, we're building a better future for communities everywhere.